The Liberation of Sundrian City by Andrew Lewis. Chapter 14. So Would Have I. As Linus slurped his stewed meat down hungrily in the guard's dining hall, the guard who had been assigned to show him around sat and intently stared at him in a rather disturbing fashion. There was a smirk that just would not fade around his jowls and a hungry look in his eyes, like a fan left alone in a room with his hero. It seemed that, for the moment, he had run out of questions, and Linus was thankful for this, for the man had been rather rudely refusing to notice Linus's exhaustion and disinclination to make conversation, and he had been hounding him since the very second they had left the Emperor's sunroom. There was only so many times that Linus could confirm that yes, he was indeed only 13. "I just can't believe it," said the guard, through a mouthful of bread. Linus, whose mouth was also full to the brim, looked up and responded with a mere raise of his eyebrows. Water dripped down his neck and back, the result of his desire to get out of the baths as quickly as possible and into the dining hall. And from his chin dripped stew, the result of his further desire to down his food and get back to room 55, where that soft and comfortable bed sat waiting for him. "Never thought I'd see anything like it. Never in a million years. You were quite amazing, you know. I mean, pity about Cressini, I guess, but still, really amazing. Bread?" Linus shrugged and took a piece of bread from the basket that the guard held in offering. "You knew Cressini?" he asked. "Of course I did. There's only just over 100 palace guards, you know. You'll get to know just about everyone eventually." "Was he a friend?" "Who, Cressini? Yeah, I suppose so. But don't worry, I don't hold anything against you. I'd have done the same thing as in your position, although perhaps with a little less pizzazz," said the guard, brandishing a butter knife in front of him in a way that suggested that some sort of sword fight had occurred during the trial. Linus bit deep into the bread and chewed thoughtfully. His eyes felt tired, and the more he spoke to this man, the less he cared to. He felt sore all over, and the desire to crawl into bed and incubate the many maladies of his aching body grew rapidly by the second. His head felt heavy and his neck ached in a struggle to keep it upright. "Can I go to bed now?" "Sure, come on. Bring some bread if you like. I usually take some bread back to my room, just so that I have something to nibble on throughout the night, you know." Linus walked zombie-like through the labyrinth of corridors to his room, the guard's incessant chatter going unheard over the call of the bed which pulsated deafening in his mind. He reached, then breached, then closed the door, and his clothing slipped off and fell to the floor. It was a relief to finally get away from the annoying guard, and Linus made a mental note to avoid him henceforth. He extinguished the lamp, which sat atop the dresser, turned and lowered himself gingerly onto the sheets. They felt crisp and new and were cool against his skin. Moonlight shone through the little window above him for scarcely a second, and then he was asleep. Linus trundled along the dust-strewn plain, the tantalizing smell of the watering hole drawing him ever forth. His skin was coated entirely in thick, dry dirt that cracked as he strode along. How long had he been gone? He wasn't sure, but it felt like his whole life. He longed so very hard to be back. He walked at a faster pace than he normally would, the allure of being home pulling him along. When she came within view, he broke into a trot, and she strode forth with her ears flapping all about and a big old grin. She rubbed her trunk across the teeth of his lower jaw, and Linus did the same to her. Here, in the dream, he knew her name. She was family, and he knew her name and that she loved him, and being reunited was a moment of such pure bliss that tears streamed down both of their faces. A loud thump. She flinched, and his heart skipped a beat. Another thump, close. War elephants, marching. But as Linus scanned the area, he saw nothing, as if the thumping was coming from an invisible source. It grew louder, and terror grew, swarming, as always, in his and his sister's heart. They huddled close together and wrapped trunks, her foot swaying side to side in distress. The thumping grew louder and louder until it was so very loud that it seemed to be nearly upon them. Then Linus awoke to a thump on his own door, penetrating the film of his dreams, and he sat stunned in his bed, listening as the guard made his way down the rest of the corridor, thumping a fist once upon each door. His head dropped dopely back to the pillow. The thumps faded. His thoughts circled around his head, narrowing ever closer back to unconsciousness, until his eyes flickered and Linus dozed once more, back into the cool morning mist. What's thumping was no match to the thrashing of his spirit. Just like when the guards had burst in to take him to the pit and he had declared internally that he wasn't ready for death, right now he wasn't ready for life. The weight of the world tugged his eyelids down, and he submitted to it and returned to the familiarity of sleep. He would awaken on his own accord. He wrapped his trunk back around his sisters and apologized for the disruption. "No!" he cried aloud, exploding out of sleep. He was awake, this time with no going back. Deimos! How long had he slept? Throw on some clothes. He hurtled down the corridor, the dining hall. He had to get to the dining hall. But which corridor was it down again? He took a guess and went sprinting down a long, narrow hall that he thought looked vaguely familiar. He rounded several corners, one by one, sprinting at top speed, and as he did so he noticed that the walls grew ever more ornate, and he became increasingly aware that he had never been wherever he was before. And just like that, before he knew it, he was lost in the labyrinth that was the palace of Sundrian City. But just as he had thought to turn and double back and start the hunt again, he saw a brief flash of what looked like the shawls of a ruby-red bathrobe crossing the junction ahead of him, and heard the chatter of a man he recognized as High Lord Ramil by voice, accompanied by what sounded like several giggling women. "Remy," he called, giving chase. "Who goes there?" came the slurred response. The giggling didn't stop, despite Ramil's enthusiastic shushing. "Linus Smith," he said, as he rounded this corner and came into sight. Ramil laughed heartily, and the women's laughter regrouped into a trilling reinforcement. "Linus Smith," he barked. "The miracle boy in the flesh. My boy, it's great to see you, but alas, I must bid you farewell. Duty calls." And at this he held up a bottle of wine that he had been hanging at his side, unnoticed by Linus thus far, and swished about its contents with a big grin and a wink and an ensemble of giggles. He sniffed loudly and lazily ogled Linus, as if trying to remember if he was supposed to say something. "What brings you out over to the Emperor's bathhouse anyway, Linus? You should be here, I don't think." "I'm looking for the guard's dining hall. I need to report to Commander Deimos," he said hurriedly. "But it's well past assembly time." "Oh, you slept in, didn't you, boy? Big trouble, tit-tit," he said with a big slobbery grin. "But then you just did fight the elephant and did the fighting with the elephants just before it, so you must be very tired. Very, very tired." For a moment, Ramil's eyes lolled about their sockets, and he swayed where he stood. "Tired," he muttered once more. Well, yes, I'm very late. Can you help me? I need to find Commander Deimos so that..." No. "No, Remy roared, all three girls ceasing their giggles immediately. "Linus, you can't show up late to a meeting with Deimos, no sir. He will probably pull a sword to you and make an example out of you. He might even make you. No. You need a good excuse, something to be the reason why, you know." Linus did not know. He had no idea what Ramil was babbling about. He shrugged confusedly, with a sly laugh. It really was something quite eye-opening to see their High Lord Ramil Colwich, a hero of the city of Sundrian, in such an inebriated state. "An excuse, boy. You need an excuse. And I think you are ready. I like you, Linus, and you should come in here and we can pretend you have been with Franklin and these lovely whores and me all night along. Come, right here." They moved to a giant brass door and he wrenched it open. As it swung forth, mineral-infused steam flooded the hall and the girls ran ahead into the room, Ramil following at their heels and beckoning Linus to follow. Linus stepped into a bathhouse unlike any other he had ever seen. It was a large tiled room with brass pipes lining the walls all around. There were several ceramic basins around the room and at least a dozen full-length mirrors. The air was thick and warm and delicious, and in the centre of the room Linus could see Emperor Frigg stewing in a huge hot tub with 4 beautiful women, his head tilted skyward and his eyes covered by a small white towel. A small hooded servant rushed about the rooms, restocking the hot tub and the mineral-infused steamers with fresh lava rocks. Remy's 3 giggling friends derobed and ran forth to join the Emperor, and Linus tried hard to keep his eyes inside his skull. "Remy, where's wine?" muttered the Emperor lazily from beneath the towel on his face. Yes, it's here, hold on." The Emperor chuckled idly, and Ramil looked awkwardly at Linus as if unsure what to say. Franklin, Linus is here too." "Linus? Yes, okay, sure," he replied, still chuckling. Ramil derobed and moved forward entirely naked to the hot tub to pour 2 goblets of wine, and Linus stood in amazement, still trying to take in this most unexpected scene. It looked to him like Ramil, who stood swaying on the spot whilst pouring the wine, and Emperor Frigg, who was also visibly drunk, had spent the entire night drinking wine and bathing with lustful women. The inner workings of the palace were really starting to prove far different from what he had imagined. Ramil gave Linus a slight shrug and beckoned him over to join the drunken orgy. It seemed like nobody else understood the ridiculousness of the situation except Linus, who still hadn't quite figured out how joining them would get him out of trouble with Deimos. But what else could he do? Surely it was too late to merely excuse himself from the situation, and so slowly and nervously, and suddenly very aware of how little hair was on his body, Linus stripped off his clothing, wandered forth and slid into the velvety hot water. Some of the women didn't seem to notice. They lolled about with their eyes closed, gripping on tight about the Emperor's arms, whilst others giggled absent-mindedly, sipping their own glasses of wine. However, one of the women looked straight-faced at Linus as if confused as to why there was a 13-year-old boy in their orgy. "I know you," she said thoughtfully. "You won the trial on rest day. What's your name?" "Ramil, wine," spluttered Emperor Frigg impatiently. "Linus Smith," said Linus, trying but failing to sound manlier than he felt. "Linus," said Frigg, shaking 2 girls off his arms to remove the towel from over his face and turning to look. His face was purple and bulbous, and he looked bewildered. "Linus, what are you doing in here? This is not the guard's bathhouse." Frigg, I told you I brought him here. It's okay, the lad slept in, needed an excuse for Deimos, okay? Shh." Ramil flapped his hand about as if to wave away the Emperor's disconcertedness. "An excuse? What excuse?" Ramil gave an exasperated sigh. The sort a wife might give to her husband. "Well, it's obvious, isn't it? If Deimos asks, we say Linus was with us all night. Easy. Here." He handed the Emperor a deep goblet of wine and proceeded to lower himself into the water. Linus noticed that the women were drinking out of different glasses, smaller, clear wine glasses, which were scattered around the tub's edge, uneven in both placement and volume. The Emperor never responded to Ramil. Instead, he gulped greedily from his goblet and sank back down into his spot in the tub. A sublime grin crept up his face, and all his worries seemed to physically melt away into the steam. Remy watched all of this happen intently with a lazy smile, his eyes narrowed feastward upon the Emperor's bliss, as if to feel it too. Then he drank from his own goblet and sank down into his spot with the same evident bliss that the Emperor had just experienced. For a minute no one spoke. The Emperor just laid back, eyes closed, grinning broadly, breathing sloppily as if he couldn't control his saliva. Remy seemed to take his bliss differently. He was without the grin. Instead, his eyes were open, and he took breaths through a wide, round mouth like a man in disbelief, or perhaps like a man stepping into ice-cold waters. He seemed to look as if he was sort of choking on amazement. He flexed and tightened his muscles as if easing into his new body. The women who weren't sleeping watched lazily through drooping, lustful eyes and swarmed about the men, surely adding to the bliss. And all the while, Linus sat in the water, naked and quite alone, watching in youthful awe. Excuse me, Emperor Frigg, could I have some wine?" he asked tentatively. Without looking or even flinching, Emperor Frigg grunted, "Of course, boy, have wine, and it's Franklin for you, okay?" Wait, Franklin, exclaimed Remy. Surely not. Our one, our wine. You can't have our wine. Linus, you have the guest wine from the barrel. Get the boy a wine, he added as an afternote, nudging awake the girl on his arm. She nodded groggily and stood up, and for Linus time seemed to slow down as she slipped silkily out of the tub, water sliding smooth down her figure, and Linus's eyes broadening to no end. Candles flickered nearby, and Linus wished there were more of them. Yes, of course. Sorry, son, said Franklin with a lazy chuckle, his eyelids flickering but never opening. This bottle is reserved for only Remy and myself. It's no ordinary wine. Well, it doesn't seem to be. It looks great, said Linus, who was starting to crave the ecstasy that they were evidently feeling. It is great. It's magic wine, son. Enchanted by Remy himself. A mouthful is bliss, a glass, heaven. Like God's gift to me. Like God himself wanted me to feel no sorrow. But it's dangerous stuff, Linus, and you are too young. I've had wine before, he said dopily. Not like this, my boy. Soon the woman returned with a glass for Linus, laughing at his oogling eyes. Linus sipped it, but as he did so, he got the distinct feeling he had missed the fun. Remy was asleep, as were most of the girls. It was impossible to tell if Franklin slept or not, as his eyes were now covered by his towel once again. You don't belong here, do you? It was the same woman who had spoken to him briefly before. Linus sank a little lower into the water and looked around the room. I don't know, replied Linus, who honestly didn't. I guess I don't know where I belong. Sure you do, she replied bracingly. Sundrian City. Linus waited patiently for what seemed like several hours, the only other person awake being the servant, who still fluttered about, until finally the Emperor stirred and grunted and arose from the water. He dressed in a robe and drank 2 goblets of chilled water before strolling over to slap Remy lightly about the face. Linus watched these happenings sneakily, feigning sleep all the while. Remy, up you get, come on, old chum. Linus, the actor, stirred from his sleep. Linus, my boy, you're awake. Have a good time this morning, did you? Asked Franklin. Franklin's face was haggard, his eyes dark and baggy and his hair dishevelled, but friendliness still radiated from it. It was great, replied Linus, although he suspected it hadn't been nearly as great for him as it had been for everybody else. His first glass of wine sat behind him, still mostly full. Should I go now? I'm a little bit worried about Commander Deimos. Ah, now you don't worry about that, Linus. You were ordered by the Emperor himself, he pointed a thumb at his chest, to miss today's training. If Commander Deimos has any issues, he can bring them up to me. Now, if I know Deimos, he will be heading back to the dining hall for some lunch within the hour. I think you'd best head there and try to meet him. Linus agreed to do so, but the Emperor's confidence hadn't quite been instilled in him, nor had his words relieved his mind of any uncertainty or worry.